Hey, everybody. It's Matt Erpelding, Vice President of Government and Community Relations from the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And today we have a great discussion planned with Senate Pro Tem Brent Hill, both about his 20-year career in the legislature and also about his next endeavor with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Senator Hill will be with us in just a minute, but I just want to thank everybody first for tuning in. I also want to remind everyone that the Boise Metro Chamber is the only 5-star accredited U.S. Chamber member in the state of Idaho, and the work that we do is to advocate for businesses and our community all across the Treasure Valley. We're a 501c6 nonprofit, and we're highly dependent upon the support and the investment of our members. And in particular for this event, we have been very lucky to secure the support from Idaho Central Credit Union and Pacific Source Health Plans. Both organizations are committed to the Boise Metro Chamber, and both organizations have been with us throughout this pandemic and many, many years before that. So before we start today, I'd like to present something from Idaho Central Credit Union, and again, thank them for supporting today's conversation. Senator Pro Tem Hill is in his 19th or close to 20th year in the Idaho State Legislature, over half of which has been as the Pro Tem of the Idaho Senate. He's been involved in everything from tax policy to healthcare policy and much, much more. He's a retired certified public accountant. He lives outside of Idaho Falls, and after he finishes his term in the legislature, he will be joining the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and he will be working on efforts to improve civility across legislatures. So with that, I'd like to welcome President Pro Tem Hill. Senator Hill, how are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have you, and we appreciate all of your service over the years. And, you know, let's just get right down to it. You're still serving. You've got until December. But the big question that's been coming up is this COVID-19 epidemic has really thrown a wrench in a host of things. You've navigated a lot of different complicated subjects between the governor and the legislature, but most recently, some members of the House had a gathering at the Capitol, and they served up papers that implied that the governor needed to be removed from office. The Senate did not participate in that. So real quick, tell us what is happening there and why is there so much divisiveness around COVID-19 and public health right now?
Well, you're right. We've never navigated through a pandemic. And so this is new territory for all of us, including the governor. He's been put in a pretty difficult position when you think about the consequences of some of the decisions that he's having to make, both economic as well as for the health and well-being of the public. And so it's a line he's got to walk, and it is a hard one. But I can't speak for all the Senate, and certainly not for all the legislature. But I, for one, think the governor's done a terrific job with what he's been dealt there. He has tried to come with that right balance in taking care of the public health, while at the same time trying to help our economy along so that it doesn't have such devastating consequences from this virus. We got a fair amount of money from the federal government, about $1.25 billion. Now, that's a lot of money for Idaho compared to our general fund. And I've met with a lot of some of my colleagues from other states in the same position, Senate presidents from other states. And we are so fortunate. Many of the states are using every bit of that money just to keep their head above water and trying to keep their government running. And here the governor has turned around and used a huge amount of that to get back into the public's pockets. Of course, we had the small business grants that were to help small businesses along, particularly those who did not get help from the federal government, from the PPP loans. He instituted the return to work bonuses, which yesterday I think was the big day to sign up for those, and I believe I saw that there were 10,000 applicants for those. And then more recently, he put in place using some of those funds to reimburse state or municipal governments, counties and cities and so forth, for their extra costs due to this COVID, which they can then turn around and use for property tax relief to the citizens. So he's really worked at using those funds, not just to keep government running, but also to keep businesses running and to help households out. So, but why the big controversy over it? Well, legislators, we like to legislate. And we like to appropriate. That's our job. That's what we've been asked to do. And so when we're out of session and we see these large amounts of money coming in and decisions being made, and we're not very much a part of that, it's frustrating to legislators because that's what we do. And so I have to give the governor credit. He has involved the legislature to a great degree. I think any legislator can call him up and give his input. His or her input and visit with the governor about concerns that they have or suggestions or ideas that they have. He's been very willing to listen, but at the bottom line, he's got to make those decisions. But he has a weekly call with the Senate, members of the Senate, majority and minority, and he has a weekly call with the members of the House, again, to keep us updated what's going on, get suggestions from us, and answer our questions and so forth. So he's done a lot of work in that area, but there is a desire, by legislators to make have more input and to be more involved in those kinds of decisions. To try to address that, we've put together some working groups that some people have read about, and those working groups are to look at not what the governor has done wrong or what we think he's done wrong or anything else, but to prepare for the future. Many of these statutes that he's being governed by are decades old. They were done in the 60s and the 70s when we were worried about nuclear fallout and those kinds of things, and some natural disasters, but certainly not pandemics. And we're having these working groups look at some of those things to see if there's a better way to structure them. We're not doing this against the governor. We're doing this in concert with the governor, because particularly if there are some of those things that need to be handled in a special session before the regular session begins, the governor's going to have to call that. So we're trying to work together with the government and look at some of those things.
Speaking of the working with the governor, this year departments were asked to take a 1% cut across the board, even with the pandemic impacting our state budget in April and May and June. The state was able to finish the year with, I think, $100 million surplus. And our rainy day fund is now close to $600 million. You're pro tem until December 5th. What's your prediction for the 2021 budget? And do you think that departments and programs in Idaho are going to have to take additional cuts moving into the next year?
Well, first of all, I have even better news for you. We just got the final numbers today, and it looks like we're going to be $131 million better off than what we thought we were when we left the session this spring. But again, we are so fortunate. So many other states are showing some huge deficits. We have a diversified economy with agriculture and technology and retail and tourism and all the different areas we have. It's helped keep our heads above water so that these federal funds can be used for other purposes. But we do have to remember, we have a June year end, and so we're talking about this last year. It just ended a few days ago at June 30th, 2020. And that's where we have the surplus from. But we need to remember that those income tax revenues, for the most part, come from income from 2019. People are paying their 2019 taxes in 2020. And so we had a wonderful 2019. But again, that was all before this COVID issue came into being. And since then, as you know, we've seen businesses close, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. We've seen people lose their jobs and lose their businesses for income for their families and so forth. And so there's a lot of uncertainty out there. We are projecting that we'll probably have a decrease from what we originally thought we were going to have for the 2021 fiscal year of about somewhere between 8 and 14% less. And so the governor's looking at this point, at least, of cutting most of those agency budgets by about 5%. Now, that's not even as much as what we're going to be down in our revenues. But I think he's trying to be cautious. We'll make up the difference on that with those rainy day funds that you referenced. We'll have to dip into those. And then some of these federal funds that we've received, hopefully we can make up the difference. But I think he's being pretty careful not to over withhold or not to cut budgets any more than absolutely necessary. And we may have to look at bigger cuts as we get partway through the year. But again, we've been very fortunate. But I think, yes, we're probably going to be looking at some cuts. Now, when I talk about cuts, I'm not necessarily talking about cuts from where we were this past fiscal year. I'm talking about reducing the increases that we had appropriated for 2021. And so, and sometimes those cuts are going to be greater than the additions that we added. So there will be some cuts, but it's not 5% from what we've been operating on under the current fiscal year, or just the fiscal year that we just barely completed.
So what I heard you say is,
that help?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at taking statewide probably 5% cuts, and we likely, even with those, will have to dip into that rainy day fund in order to try to cover costs, or maybe the federal government will pass another economic stimulus and push some money to locals. We don't know exactly yet.
We don't know exactly yet. All we got is what we have right in front of us right at the moment, and that's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. There's this piece of me that doesn't miss it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and there's that piece of me that says I'm not going to miss that part.
Right, exactly. You've served for 20 years, plus or minus, and during that time, you served with 4 different governors. What are you most, and of that time, over half of it was in leadership. So what are you most proud of? What is your single greatest success as a leader in the Senate?
Well, you'd think that a politician could come up with all kinds of things that he's proud of. I think if you ask anybody who serves in government, whether it's at the local level or the state level or even the federal level, I think most of them would tell you the greatest fulfillment really doesn't come from what people see on the floor of the Senate or even in the newspaper or in interviews. The most fulfilling part comes from things that go on behind the scenes, of being able to help individual citizens, individual constituents that may have problems. It may be something dealing with a problem with Medicaid and not getting the help that they need. It might be somebody in the National Guard that was promised a bonus if he reenlisted and then didn't get it. But just having those contacts to be able to help people with their individual problems, I think that's the most fulfilling. I am pleased with the atmosphere that we've been able to create in the Senate. I think people would be surprised at how well we get along between the minority and the majority, between the various committees and so forth. I've never twisted anybody's arm to vote a certain way, even though I've been the leader of the Senate. Every senator represents their own constituency and has their own conscience and have to make that decision. Now, do I try to persuade? Do I try to influence and reason with them? Yes, but I think letting people be responsible to those who elected them is much more effective than leadership making threats or being intimidating with them. And so I am pleased with the atmosphere that we have in the Senate. Could it be better? Absolutely. But I think it's improving all the time.
What did you leave on the table? What do you feel like you needed, that you would have liked to have accomplished, but will have to be left for the next generation?
Well, let me mention a couple. When I went into the legislature, I wanted to help people regain greater trust, at least in the state government. People become very disenchanted. They hear about the scandals. They hear about things that people voting some way that they don't like, and so forth. And a lot of that comes from negative campaigns that are going on during elections and so forth. But I wanted people to have greater trust in their government. And as I look back over the last 20 years, I don't think we've accomplished that. I think that if anything, people are more polarized. They probably are more suspicious of their government, particularly at the federal level, but sometimes even at the state level than they were when I started. And that part makes me feel bad that I wasn't able to do more in that regard. I think the other thing I'd have to bring up is as something we didn't get accomplished has to do with the LGBTQ community, and add the words and balancing that with religious freedom and the concerns that people have on both sides of that issue, and trying to come up with a compromise that would benefit everybody, that would address the fears that people have on both sides. Those on the religious side who are concerned about having their religious rights or their religious freedoms infringed upon by simply adding the words, and certainly those who are concerned about losing their jobs or being discriminated against in other ways. We need to find a solution to that, and waiting to rely on the Supreme Court or other courts to make those decisions. Court cases are all, they're winner take all. They're one side or the other. And yet, I think a great deal of what we should be doing is working together, trying to come up with compromises that will help both sides. It means that one side will not get 100% of what they want. But if both sides can get 75, 80% of what they want, I think that's a win. And I feel bad that I worked on that for years, actually, but I feel bad we weren't able to accomplish more in that area.
I think that's a good segue to talk about, how you ran the Senate. You didn't run the Senate with an iron fist, and add the words was such an important issue, and it is such an important issue. You and I were at odds at this when I was in the legislature, not necessarily at odds, but we had a couple of loggerheads around public accommodations that people struggled with. And as hard as you worked on it, it seemed like it was very hard for you to get the rest of your body to move with you. What are some of the struggles that you had as pro tem to really focus on those issues of compromise, those issues that are essential to our democracy, like protecting the minority, making sure that the minority have the protections they need to be able to get through this world, et cetera? How did you approach that whole aspect?
Well, I believe that one of the responsibilities of a good leader, a good legislative leader, whether that's in the House or the Senate, majority or minority, is that you get things done, that you actually are able to accomplish something. I'm not as big into just making political statements or making grandstanding of some kind. We need to actually get things done. And in order to get things done, you got to have votes. It comes down to counting the votes. And this was just an area we did not have the votes. We didn't have them in order to get a compromise, let alone just simply add the words, which was a one-sided approach. And so if you're going to provide those kind of protections to those who need protections, and I'm talking about those who had fears with their religious rights as well as their human rights, if you belong to or are concerned about the LGBTQ community. In order to get the votes, you've got to come up with some kind of compromise that will gain enough support from enough people in both the House and in the Senate, because you can't do it with just one House. You have to have both of them, have a majority of both. We always talk about, we got to have 18 votes and we got to have 36 votes, and we got to have one vote. The one vote being the governor in order to get something done. But we just couldn't come up with a compromise that we could get both sides to concede, make a few concessions in order to get, like I think, a huge percent of what they want. We decided to wait and see what the courts would do, or we decided to wait to see what the federal government would do, or there were those who just felt like there really wasn't a problem, we won't do anything. It is a problem. We're talking about fellow human beings here, and we're talking about people's deeply held religious beliefs and people's way of life, and we need to treat each other as human beings and be a little sympathetic towards the concerns and the fears and the livelihoods of our brothers and sisters. And so I hope it doesn't go away when I go away. It's going to continue to be there as a problem, and I hope that we can make some progress on that as time goes on.
Well, speaking of fears, you've been at the center of some of the largest healthcare reforms in an entire generation. Partly based on your situation. You were there when the federal government passed the ACA, and the fears that came from that, including people yelling that there were going to be death panels and other stuff. And the Idaho legislature was like a whipsaw on this issue. There were 2 years where there were attempts to, quote, nullify the ACA in the state of Idaho. Then there was changes in leadership, and we passed the State Health Care Exchange. And then a ballot initiative led by Reclaim overwhelmingly passed Medicaid at the ballot box. That is a whipsaw wild ride from nullification to full Medicaid in a matter of 4 or 5 years. What's your insight into that? Why did we have such a wild ride on that?
Well, you don't go after the easy issues, do you? I mean, this has
Not my job.
Been going on, been going on for years, and you're right. It's run the gamut. First of all, just because you hear a legislator talk about something they think should be done, doesn't mean that it really has much chance in the legislature, or that it's really it should be a concern to the public. But the public doesn't always know that. For instance, nullification wasn't going to go anywhere in the Idaho State Senate. Nullification, of course, is the doctrine that any state legislature can nullify any federal law that they feel is inappropriate or unconstitutional in the minds of those state lawmakers. We settled that issue back at the time of the Civil War, and so this is not something that was going to go anywhere in the state legislature. But yet we had to go through the process and have those who felt that strongly about it. They had to be convinced that it wasn't going to go anywhere. Even after we passed the Citizen Initiative in 2018. In 2019 legislature, we had to go through all the efforts. I mean, there were those who wanted to overturn the Citizens Initiative, and so that was discussed quite at length. And and it wasn't until people realized, hey, there are not the votes to overturn the initiative that was passed by a majority of the citizens. Then there was talk, well, we're not going to fund it then. We're just not going to pay, it's going to die if we don't fund it. And so, that went on for a few weeks, that discussion. And yet most of us knew that we weren't going to overturn it. We were going to go ahead and fund it. The Attorney General made it very clear that whether we voted to fund it or not, we had a legal liability to provide the funding, because it was a statute. It was a law that was passed by the people. And so we have to watch that process go through from beginning to end. And sometimes that's painful, particularly if you're outside looking in and you say, oh no, they're going to nullify this, or they're going to overturn what the people want, or they're not going to provide the funding that is needed, because that's what the media is picking up on, because that's what we're discussing at that moment in time. But again, most of us knew where that was going to end up, that we were going to go along with it, with what the people needed to do. Now, we did have to make put some what we called sideboards or enhancements, or whatever words you want to use, on that in order to get the votes to get the funding and get it through. But in the end, we did fund it. We did set up a state-based health insurance exchange, which, by the way, is still, if not the best health insurance exchange, in the top 2 health insurance exchanges in the nation. Ours is being run very well. We didn't have the ghosts and the goblins that people thought were going to come when we did some of these things. And quite frankly, it's working very well. Why did it take so long? You got to look back at the Affordable Care Act in the first place. I mean, how many Republicans in Congress supported the Affordable Care Act? None in the Senate, one in the House, and that was only after there was a 218 vote majority, so that person knew it was going to pass anyway. And so you had this huge Republican resistance to passing the Affordable Care Act, and then you just can't just throw it down to the states, particularly a state as Republican as Idaho's legislature is, and say it's all going to run smoothly now. We're just going to implement it and not have any problems. Congress could have fixed it. After the Supreme Court made decisions that ended up putting some of the poorest, the most vulnerable of our citizens in the worst situation, and most people know that that's the gap we're talking about. That was created by the Supreme Court case, and Congress could have fixed that gap so much more easily than leaving it up to each individual state. And I think some of us were hoping that Congress would finally address that. Congress wasn't able to do that, and so it came down to the states. And when the legislature doesn't act, then the people are going to act, and that's what they did. And so we have what we have. And I think we're trying to make the best we can out of that decision that was made by the people, and try to do it in a responsible way, fiscally responsible, as well as in a caring way, being concerned about our fellow citizens here in the state of Idaho, that they receive the health care that they need.
You know, the other area where you were an expert, not just in the legislature, but because of your profession as a CPA, was tax policy. And you've been involved in much of the tax reform since the early 2000s, starting with the special session or the initial sales tax under Kempthorne, and then the special session under Risch, and then income tax reductions. Our three-legged stool, which is because Idaho it has essentially sales tax, property tax, and income tax, seems like over the last 15 years has constantly been in flux. Where do you think we are? What do you think needs to be done to better stabilize our tax system and ensure we have the resources to provide for the services that people need, but also make sure that they have the lowest tax burden possible? What else needs to happen?
Well, first of all, you probably didn't notice, but you can't use the term tax policy without bringing a smile to my face. That's my first love. I chaired the local government taxation committee for many years, and of course served on the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, which is the other side of the formula there. But there are some unique problems in Idaho that I think a lot of people don't completely sit down and think about. And that comes back to that three-legged stool you're talking about. And for those that may not be familiar with it, we rely heavily on our three major taxes here in Idaho: income tax, sales tax, and property taxes. Property taxes do not come into the state. They go to the local municipalities, to the cities and the counties and so forth, other taxing districts. The major source of income for the state, those major sources are sales tax and income taxes. And then there is revenue sharing from both of those, sales tax and income tax, that goes back to the local governments as well. But that's our three-legged stool. And it's always difficult to get the right balance, because if you're sitting on a stool where one leg is shorter than the other, another leg's longer, it's really hard to stay balanced. And so we refer to that as our three-legged stool. Idaho, however, we border 6 states. 2 of those states have no sales tax. Now, when you think that there are only 5 states in the union that have no sales tax, and 2 of them border Idaho, that's quite phenomenal. Then you also consider, of those 6 states that border Idaho, 3 of them have no income tax. And again, when there's only 7 states in the whole United States that don't have income tax, and 3 of them border Idaho, that puts us in kind of an awkward position, in that we have to compete with each of our sister states that we border there. Some states rely very heavily on income tax and may not have a sales tax. Others rely more heavily on sales tax and less on property tax or things like that. And so we need to try to keep the balance, because if we rely too heavily on sales tax, that means our sales tax rates are going to be more. And if you're trying to run a business right next to a state that has no sales tax at all, that's going to be very harmful to your business here in Idaho. And so we've tried to broaden the base, keep the sales tax at a reasonable level. Our sales tax levels are about average or lower than average for the nation. Our property tax burden, even though it's the tax that everybody hates the most. Everybody hates paying property taxes, but we have one of the lowest property tax burdens in the nation, and our income tax is a little lower than the average for the nation as well. Our overall tax burden is quite low in Idaho, and we've tried to maintain that, but we've done it on this three-legged stool. So what do we need to do in the future? We tackled one of those, and in making online sales subject to sales tax. Our brick and mortar businesses were operating at a definite disadvantage where they had to charge sales tax, and people could go online and they could go into the brick and mortar store and get the spiel and find out all about the television that they thought they'd like to get, and have the salesman run down everything with them, and then go online and purchase it. And so we did level the playing field with that in taxing online sales, including those from Amazon and other places. We need to stay competitive on in our income tax area. One state that is very similar to Idaho in that they also rely on a three-legged stool. The only state that neighbors us is Utah, and they rely on all three of those taxes as well. But they have restructured their income tax. They did it with a little bit of glass and mirrors, but at the same time, it's been effective for them, and their top rate is lower than Idaho's top rate. And so the legislature's been working over the last couple of decades to try to reduce the income tax rate. Now we have an initiative out there to increase the income tax rate and put that into public education. So we'll have to deal with that if that were to pass the people. And I think we've got to put more attention into particular residential property taxes. The values of residences have been going up much faster than commercial property in Idaho because of the huge demand. We've had such an influx of people coming into Idaho. They all need a place to live, and that has driven the price of homes up, particularly in some areas like the Treasure Valley, and that has shifted the property tax burden over to residential homes and off of commercial property to some degree. And so I think we've got to deal with all of those, but we've got to keep the three-legged stool in place as we do it, so that we don't put our businesses and our friends and neighbors that are on the borders of Idaho, neighboring some of these other states, at some kind of competitive disadvantage. That's a fine line to walk, I'll tell you that.
You know, I was thinking about that as you were talking, and as COVID has increasingly sent people to work from home, there may be an even greater shift if we see a devaluation in the commercial real estate sector while our residential sector continues to inflate in terms of its value. And do you think that now the House has been the sticking point on that? I know that the Senate passed a bill that would have increased the homeowners exemption to try to rebalance some of the imbalance. Do you think if there's massive deflation in the commercial sector and increased valuations in the residential sector, that it'll force the legislature to act?
I think it will certainly force us to consider it again, and maybe even more seriously, whether they'll actually act or not. You look at it on the commercial side too, though, Matt. If your property is going down in value because you can't rent it out, you're already struggling financially, and now you're going to go and shift some of the property tax burden to those businesses, to that commercial real estate. I mean, we'll talk about a double whammy. And so, there's just so many dominoes that go into this. But you're absolutely right. I was just talking to my son this weekend. He's a realtor down in Utah, and he said exactly the same thing. There are more and more people moving back. Some of them back with their parents, but many of them just moving back and living where they want to live. They want to live in the West instead of the East Coast, or they want to live in Idaho instead of California or whatever. And so they're coming back, putting an even greater strain on the housing values, which causes those property taxes to go up as that shifts to residential property, and so it makes it very complex. But you're absolutely right, and I think we're probably going to see more of that, because when COVID goes away, I think some businesses are going to realize, hey, we can operate with more of our employees at home. We don't have to have this much office space, and we can do this more economically. And some employees are finding they quite like doing it that way. It took some people a while to figure out how to really be efficient at home, but I think most people are catching on to that who are actually working at home now. So this could be an ongoing problem that we're going to have to address.
Yeah. Speaking of ongoing problems, the business community has wrestled with this issue for years, and that is, this year in particular, social issues are just super sticky in Idaho. And in general, the business community and business organizations don't engage in social issues until it really becomes an economic issue. So there was a piece of legislation that passed this year that was extremely controversial, and is likely to cost, in particular, the Treasure Valley a minimum of $15 million and probably upwards of $100 million in economic
on the transgender athletes we're talking about, right?
And the challenge with that is, and my question for you is, how can, when we know that there's going to be that kind of an economic impact on a social issue, and it's going to really harm the vitality of communities across the state, how can business organizations better engage on social issues so that they can have the conversation and not get sucked into some of the partisan and politicized and polarized warfare that occurs inside of the legislature?
Well, that's an excellent question. And businesses are not that much different than individuals in that we all need to get more involved in watching what's going on in the political process, and trying to evaluate how that affects our families, or if you're a business owner, how that's going to affect our business and our customers. And so sometimes we leave that up to business associations, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, or the Chamber of Commerce, or other things to watch out for our interests. You're right that businesses usually get more involved with tax policy and things like that they see that are going to affect them more directly. Social issues are tough issues. They're tough for legislators. I think that some people see social issues as all this way or all that way, because to them it's just so clear in their mind the way it should be, and those issues are a lot more difficult than that. I always envy the extremists that can take one side or the other and do it with a completely clear conscience. I agonize over some of these issues, and particularly on social issues. I think those are sometimes very difficult. I'm an accountant. I got to add up the debits and credits, and I've never found any of these issues that are all credits or all debits. There's a combination of both, and you have to evaluate those things. And the economic consequences of social issues are sometimes that are neglected, and sometimes not even known. And so I think, like you say, businesses need to be watching those things. They need to be involved. Now, how can they better be involved? The same way anybody that's listening to this can be more involved, and that's being proactive directly with those legislators that represent you. I'm much more affected by a business from my hometown that calls me up, or we visit somehow about how some issue is going to affect them, how it's going to affect their family, and how it's going to affect how they do business, and how this is going to have an adverse consequence on the economy as a whole, or on their industry, or something like that. That's much more effective in my mind than just some lobbyist group saying, hey, we're opposed or we're in favor of that. And so it takes time. But if people are willing to take the time, if business owners who are just out there just scraping and working, trying to make the economy work and make their business go, and employees that are out there just trying to put bread on the table for their families and so forth, if they can take the time, though, to watch these issues and express their feelings, not only their disdain for what their legislator might be doing, but ideas of how we could be doing it better. things that we may not have thought of before. I think those are the most useful ways to come up with alternatives rather than just saying, this is bad, vote against it. Why should I vote against it? Or this is good. What makes it good? And so it takes personal involvement, and that takes time. I don't blame anyone for not getting more involved. Goodness sakes, I'm just thrilled when some people will at least get out and vote, and let alone having personal contact with their lawmakers. But that's what it takes. And for lawmakers to better understand the issues and what the consequences of those issues are going to be, they need to hear from the people that are going to be most affected. So that's not an easy answer. It requires some commitment on more than just the legislator's part, but it's the best and most effective way to get it done.
Well, so you're moving on, which I'm sure you're excited about, and you have a great opportunity. Idaho is one of the first states that really committed itself to the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And in committing itself to the National Institute for Civil Discourse, we have former chairman and Representative Wintro. We've got a facilitator in Representative Packer, Senator Winder. There are a lot of people that are involved with the National Institute of Civil Discourse. And now you're joining another Idahoan in Keith Allred to head up the next generation for the program with the National Institute of Civil Discourse. What do you expect to accomplish? What are your goals, and why are you headed down that road?
Well, first of all, for those who may not know Keith, let me just explain his role. He's over the whole National Institute of Civil Discourse. He was recruited for that about a year ago. He's a Twin Falls native. He's a cowboy, loves horsing and rodeo, whatever that is. But anyway, he's a great guy. I worked with Keith for many years, particularly when I chaired the Local Government and Taxation Committee. He was very involved in tax policy. He put together an organization of Idaho where he sent out briefs on various issues that the legislature was dealing with, and he would try to present the pros and cons of each issue in as fair a way as he possibly could. And then he would have those people from around the state express their opinions on what the legislature should do in those issues. And so I worked with him as he made those reports to us. And like I said, many of those things had to do with tax policy. He later gave that up as he decided to run for governor in the state of Idaho. And he lost that bid for governor. And he's a Harvard graduate. I don't know if he's a Harvard graduate. He's actually a professor at Harvard, works with conflict resolution and things like that, and does a lot of consulting. And so he's got a lot of good background on this, and he's now back in Washington, D.C., heading this up. And when I announced that I wasn't going to run for office again, Keith approached me and asked if I might be interested in helping them out in a particular aspect of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and that is the part where they deal with state legislatures. And so my job is going to be to work with state legislatures across the United States and hopefully take some of the things that I've learned over the last 19 years in the Idaho legislature and help them apply them in a way that will increase the effectiveness and the civility at the state level. We feel like if we're going to improve civility and mutual respect at the federal level, we need to start at the state level. At any given point, about 50% of the people that are serving in Congress once served in the state legislature. So if they can learn some of those skills, some of the importance of working in a civil environment and being able to do the people's business in that kind of environment, then hopefully when they get into Congress, it's going to flow over into the national realm of politics. And so that's what I'm going to be working with. Those are my goals to work with those various state legislatures. I've had a lot of contact with Senate presidents from across the nation in conferences we've been to together and in discussions we've shared. And so we're not the only people doing it. There are national organizations that are working to make things more less political and more issue-oriented. National Conference of State Legislatures, National Council of State Governments, and different organizations, they work on those things. But we're going to be actually going into these legislatures and having workshops with the legislatures and the various legislators that are there of both parties, of both houses, trying to help them understand how to get along better and to use civility in a very productive and positive way. Those are my goals.
Those are great goals. And as you know, civility often runs headlong into the concept of power. And civility and power are, they don't often work well together. And so if you're in the minority, people say that civility to the majority is that the minority be quiet, and the minority says that the majority doesn't pass any of their legislation. And so, you know, they're not civil. And so kind of talk about how you approach the idea of civility within a framework of power where every member of the body is trying to increase influence or trying to expand what they're able to accomplish, because that's the real trick.
Well, I think that the first thing is we need to learn, you know, the appropriate use of power. What is power? What's the purpose of it? What are we trying to accomplish with it? I mean, I wrote a book a few years ago, and one of the things I wrote in there is the only good reason to acquire more power is in order to do more good. And so power can be used in an appropriate way and in a helpful way, but there are different levels of power. And so that's what we hope to be able to teach or help people understand better at the legislative level, because there's the lowest level. It's the easiest out, you know, and that's where you say, well, if I don't get my way, you're not going to get your way. I'm going to take something away from you if I don't get my way. You're going to be punished. And the more powerful you become, such as a member of leadership or something like that, you're in a better position to make that other legislator's life pretty miserable. And so we call that, coercive power. You're using coercion to get your way. But that's the lowest kind of power. And that's the kind of power we sometimes see in politics. It's the one that's most obvious because that's the one that causes the most conflict. And conflict is, let's face it, the media loves conflict. It's a lot more fun to report on conflict than on cooperation. And so we see that quite a bit. But is that really an effective use of power? Because those who are being threatened, they don't have any loyalty to that leader. They don't have any commitment to trying to make that leader's goals become realities. And so it's really a low level of power, even though it's a common type of power and one that we often see in the political realm. But we need to move up to a higher level of power. And the next level is what we call a persuasive level of power. That's when you entice people with promises. That's when I go to you, Matt, and I say, well, if you'll help me get this bill passed, I'll help you get that bill passed. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. It's the father who goes to his son and says, hey, I'll give you $10 for every A that you get. And then he uses a little coercive power and says, and I'll also ground you for, one day for every F that you get or whatever. So sometimes we use a combination of different levels of power, but the real highest level of power is what we call influential power. That's when people trust their leader. When they want their leader to be successful because they like their leader and they trust their leader to do things that are good and that are for the right reason. And so they'll follow that leader to the ends of the earth and back. And that kind of power, that only comes through showing respect, and it comes through showing civility. That's the only way you can gain that kind of trust. And so civility is it doesn't go head on with power. It actually creates the higher level of power because that's how you accomplish those things. And then if you're using that power, like I say, to do good things with it, then that helps build the trust not only of those who are asked to follow you, but also the public. But it's too rare. And so I guess that's part of my goal, as well as the goal of many others, to try to bring us to a higher level of power. And so that's what I'm going to be working on. You do it, one legislator at a time. Sometimes you do it one relationship at a time.
When I was in the legislature, and you and I talked about this when I was in the legislature, one of the problems is this idea of structural incivility, where rules are put in place to further entrench the people in power. And the best example nationally that's occurring right now is the structural incivility that's associated with gerrymandering. We're lucky in Idaho where it's very difficult to gerrymander because we put something in place that forces collaboration, that forces people to come up with the fairest districts. But Democrats and Republicans alike misuse their power and gerrymander in an effort to further entrench their power. How do you see yourself addressing some of these structural incivilities as it relates to civility and as it relates to power?
Well, Matt, as you know, we don't have a perfect...
As you know, I like to ask the hard questions.
Yeah, you sure do. We don't have a perfect system, and none of us are perfect human beings either. Everybody's jockeying for political advantage. And why? Because they believe their motives are good. They believe that, their cause is just. And in fact, I read a while back, I read about a study that was done on conflict. And the researchers actually interviewed Palestinians and Israelis in the Middle East, a lot of conflict there, but they also interviewed Republicans and Democrats in the United States. And I won't get this exactly right, but what they found was that each side felt that its own group was more motivated by love and goodness than they were by hate or evil. Okay, and every group also thought that the other people on the other side, they were motivated more by hatred or ignorance, and so, in other words, every group thinks they're the good guys. We're the ones who are more fair, we're compassionate, we're honest, and our rivals are the bad guys. They're uninformed, they're dishonest, they're even evil. Okay, and so we demonize each other. And then we use that demonization in our own minds to justify taking positions that are not fair, that create some of this structure and civility, as you call it. And I've seen it not so much in Idaho because I haven't lived that long, but it used to be this way in Idaho. But in states where the balance of power between the Republicans and the Democrats is more even, you'll see from time to time, particularly on presidential election years, where a legislature will shift. The power will go, the majority will become the minority, and the minority will become the majority. And if you'll follow that very carefully, which I like to do because I'm a political junkie, you'll find that a lot of times those who were in the minority, who were very unhappy with the way the majority were, the way that things were being handled by the majority, as they became members of the majority, they ended up doing some of the same things. In other words, the abused became the abusers. And I don't know that I have a perfect solution to that, but in the National Institute for Civil Discourse, we do have a program. It's called Golden Rule 2020. And we all know what the Golden Rule is. But, if we can remember that, again, that we're all human beings, and that if we're in the minority, if I'm in the majority, I need to place myself as if I'm in the minority. And what would be fair in those kinds of circumstances? It's kind of like, I'm the oldest of three boys. And as I was growing up, I was the biggest and I was the strongest for a while. And yet I was smart enough at times to sit down and think, well, if I treat my little brother like this, he's getting bigger. And one of these times he's going to be stronger and he's going to be larger than I am. And he might just treat me the way I've been treating him. And we need to think about that, I guess, if we're motivated by negative motivation, think about it that way. If we're motivated with more positive attitudes, we need to think about treating people in the other party, in the minority, which is always not going to have as much power as the majority, but giving them, treating them with fairness. And again, it's going to be one person at a time and one legislature at a time. I wish I had a silver bullet to say, hey, we just need to do this and it'll all be taken care of. Not there yet.
So last question. I know that we've covered a huge gambit, but partisan polarization, as you mentioned earlier, is really problematic. You have parties that are taking stances like completely defund the police, or you also have parties that are taking stances saying let's repeal the 17th Amendment and make it so people can't vote for their senator. I mean, some of these like absolutist stances seem to be a root cause in this incivility that's occurring, this unwillingness to compromise. How's the National Institute for Civil Discourse going to really effectively draw people into an environment where collaboration is okay, cooperation is supported, and maybe our legislatures start to have a different conversation than what you said, which is they're evil or they're evil, and we're 100% right. It just doesn't seem like we're moving in the right direction.
Well, sometimes we're not, and that's what we need to try to turn around. I know we're running short on time, but let me just take a moment and kind of go through the steps that we do when we do these workshops with legislatures, and maybe it'll give you a feel for what we hope to accomplish. First of all, we need to talk about why civility. Why is it important? Because there are some people out there, including lawmakers, who think that bullying, intimidation, threats, that's the best way to get things done. And so talking about those levels of power and why it's important to show civility in order to gain that trust and to be an effective leader and to get things done. So we talk about that. And then we try to take people, we usually break up into smaller groups, and we go through some personal journeys and let people talk about some of their personal journeys, not necessarily what got them into politics, but maybe an event or an experience that changed the direction of their lives. And those are tender things. We did that in Idaho when we went through these workshops. And again, you mix people up between the House and the Senate, between the minority and the majority, and you learn that we are really human beings. That this is not just a lawmaker sitting there over in some seat. This is a father. This is a grandmother. This is a brother and a sister. I mean, they have feelings. And if you attack someone, even in a political campaign environment, and do it with half truths, you've got to realize that person's children are reading that stuff. Their grandchildren are being exposed to that. And when you realize that these are again, our brothers and sisters that have a lot of the same motivations and the same feelings we do, that's what brings us together. And that's part of the problem we have at the national level. Some of those people in Congress, they can go days and even weeks and never see each other. We can't do that in the Idaho legislature, and I'm grateful for that. And then we try to identify some of those problem areas. And again, like you could be able to talk about some of those structural incivilities that you feel might be present. And we can talk about those problem areas and then come up with an action plan to try to address those things. And then, of course, you've got the follow-up and the accountability. But Matt, I don't want to put you on the spot, but quite frankly, you and I worked this out pretty good. I think we both had a great mutual respect for one another. We both want the same things for Idaho. We always have. We wanted to make Idaho a better place to live and to raise our families and to do businesses. And we may disagree from time to time on the best way to do that. But see, I don't question your motives. I may question your judgment once in a while, okay? I mean,
no one questions my judgment.
Yeah, but we may have different ways of accomplishing the goals, but our goals are basically the same. And when we realize that, we start seeing what we have in common rather than where we're at odds. And I think that's what we got to do to get rid of some of this poison that you talked about. We've got to start viewing each other as fellow citizens here, trying to make this experiment that we called America, make it work. And it only works, good ideas are not reserved to one party. Good people are not reserved to one party or another. And we need to realize that and work more closely together. So again, I know it's easier said than done, But I'm dedicated to spending, at least the next few months or years of my life trying to make it happen in Idaho, but also other places in the nation.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Hill, for having this conversation about civility and recognizing that differing points of views doesn't necessarily make people uncivil. It's the next steps we take to demonize one another that creates that incivility. And we really appreciate all you have done in your service to the state. We wish you the best of luck with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. I hope to cross paths with you through that organization. And to everybody listening today, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. And I want to thank Idaho Central Credit Union and Pacific Source Health Plans for continuing support the work that the Chamber does. And we'll see you next time. And thank you again, Senator Hill.
Thank you so much. Best wishes to all of you.